Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we follow Diep as she finds comfort and courage beside James's mother, Mrs. Huyen. While recovering from illness, Diep confides her love for James, but also her fear that their worlds are too different. Yet instead of judgment, Mrs. Huyen offers gentle wisdom, showing that love isn't about wealth or status, but sincerity and devotion. When James returns, his care eases every doubt in Diep's heart, turning a quiet day into a promise of faith and togetherness. Stay with us until the end to see how honesty and compassion can heal even the most fragile hearts. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. The soft crackle of the fire fills the small kitchen, blending with the gentle bubbling of porridge on the stove. Morning light filters through thin curtains, painting golden streaks on the wooden floor. Diep lies in bed, propped up by a pillow, her pale face warmed by the glow of the fire. Near the stove, Mrs. Huyen, James's mother, stirs the pot slowly, the rhythmic sound of the spoon comforting in its simplicity. "You really didn't have to do this, Auntie," Diep says softly, her voice trembling. "I've troubled you and James too much already." Mrs. Huyen turns with a smile that reaches her eyes. "Trouble? Oh, nonsense. You're part of this home now, dear. Besides," she chuckles lightly, "if I leave the cooking to my son, we'd both starve." Diep's lips curve into a small smile, though her chest feels tight. She's not used to such warmth. It both soothes and scares her. The scent of rice porridge fills the air, thick with ginger and pork, wrapping the room in comfort. "Rest, Diep," Huyen continues gently. "The farm's noisy these days. Construction everywhere. Too much for you right now." Diep lowers her gaze to her frail hands resting on the blanket. "I just feel useless. The workers are busy. James is managing everything, and I'm just here, doing nothing." The spoon pauses mid-stir. "You're healing," Huyen says firmly. "That's not nothing. You think James wants a strong partner just for the work? No. He wants you well, alive, and smiling again. That's what matters." Her words sink deep into Diep's heart, stirring something tender inside. She doesn't know how to respond, so she just watches as the woman ladles porridge into a bowl. Huyen moves with practiced grace, steady, sure, and kind. When she places the steaming bowl on the small table beside the bed, Diep catches the faint scent of ginger again. "Minced meat or bone broth?" Huyen asks, half teasing. Diep blinks, caught off guard by the gentleness of the question. "Minced meat, please," she says, smiling shyly. "Good choice," Huyen replies, setting down a small plate of pickled radish. "You need strength, not just comfort food." Diep picks up the spoon, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," she murmurs. "I don't know how to repay you." "Don't," Huyen says simply, sitting on the edge of the bed. When you love someone, caring for what they love comes naturally. The words strike a chord so deep that Diep almost forgets to breathe. She looks up, startled. "Auntie." Huyen smiles knowingly. "You think I haven't seen the way you look at James? Or the way he looks at you? That boy has never smiled like that before. Not since his father passed." Diep feels her cheeks burn. "I do love him," she admits quietly, voice trembling as if the confession itself could shatter her. But our worlds are so different. His family, his life, it's all so far from mine. I'm afraid he'll realize that one day and regret choosing me. Silence settles over the room, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. Huyen studies her for a long moment before speaking. You know, I used to think the same thing when I married my husband. He came from a city family. I was just a farmer's daughter. But love doesn't ask where you came from. It asks what you're willing to give, to build, to protect. Diep's eyes glisten. But what if it's not enough? It's always enough, Huyen replies softly. If it's true. The conversation lingers like a melody, tender and raw. Diep takes another spoonful of porridge, the warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in weeks, she feels the heaviness in her heart ease just a little. Huyen pours a glass of water and sets it beside her. Eat, then take your medicine. You'll need your strength back if you plan to help James finish that farm. Diep nods, swallowing both porridge and emotion. He works so hard. Sometimes I wonder if I even deserve him. Huyen chuckles softly. Deserve has nothing to do with love. If he's chosen you, then that's enough. Don't waste time doubting what's already yours. Her words hang in the air, heavy with warmth. Diep lowers her eyes, unsure how to respond. She feels both seen and exposed. As she finishes her meal, Huyen carefully adjusts the pillow behind her back, fussing like a mother hen. You remind me of myself, she says with a grin. Always worrying, always thinking too much. James needs someone like you, someone who cares deeply. Just don't let fear make you forget your worth. Diep laughs softly, a sound she hasn't heard from herself in days. I'll try. Good girl, Huyen says, patting her hand. Now lie back. I'll wash the dishes and check on the workers. When Huyen leaves the room, Diep's eyes drift to the window. Outside, the rice fields sway gently in the morning breeze, waves of green under a pale blue sky. She can hear faint laughter from the workers in the distance, voices full of life and purpose. Her chest tightens again, but this time, it's not from sadness. It's from longing. She wants to be out there again, beside James, helping, building, dreaming. Diep closes her eyes and breathes deeply, the scent of rice and earth flooding her senses. One day soon, she whispers to herself. Moments later, she hears footsteps approaching again. Huyen returns with a clean towel and places it neatly on the chair. James called earlier, she says casually. He's checking on supplies at the market, but should be home by lunch. Diep nods, trying to hide her nervousness. Does he ever talk about me when he's with you? Huyen pauses, lips curling into a knowing smile. Every day. Sometimes to the point I have to tell him to stop before he forgets to eat. Diep bursts into quiet laughter, disbelief and joy mingling in her expression. Really? Really, Huyen replies, eyes twinkling. He's never been one to talk much, but with you, he does. He worries if you've eaten, if you're cold, if you're lonely. He's a stubborn boy, but his heart's in the right place. Tears prick Diep's eyes. I didn't know he... Of course you didn't, Huyen interrupts softly. Men like him show love through work, not words. He builds because he wants to give you something lasting. That farm isn't just land, it's his promise. The words sink deep. Diep feels a lump rise in her throat, her heart swelling with both love and guilt. "I want to be worthy of that promise," she whispers. "I want to stand beside him, not behind." "Then you will," Huyen says firmly. "You already are." The room grows still again, filled with quiet understanding. Outside, a bird chirps, its song carried through the open window. The day feels lighter somehow, like the weight of fear has loosened its grip, leaving space for something new to grow. Diep rests her head against the pillow, her lips curving into a soft smile. For the first time in a long while, she isn't just surviving. She's beginning to believe. The afternoon sun drifts low across the yard, turning the rice fields outside into a sea of soft gold. Inside, the faint aroma of ginger and rice still lingers in the air. Lytudiep sits by the window, wrapped in a light blanket, sketching lines on a small notepad. Her handwriting is shaky, but each word is filled with quiet determination. Plans for the farm, for the market stall, for the life she dreams of building with James. The door creaks open. Mrs. Huyen steps in, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you up to there, dear?" Diep glances up, a little startled. "Just making notes. I was thinking about the next planting schedule." Huyen raises an eyebrow, half amused. "Already? You barely finished your medicine?" Diep laughs sheepishly. "It helps me feel useful. I don't want to slow everyone down." "Slowing down isn't a sin," Huyen says, taking a seat beside her. "Sometimes life forces you to pause so you can gather strength. You've been through enough, Diep. It's all right to rest." Diep hesitates, then lowers her voice. "I just don't want anyone to think I'm weak." Huyen looks at her, the corners of her eyes softening. "You know, being strong doesn't always mean doing everything. Sometimes it means knowing when to stop, breathe, and trust that you're still enough." The words settle over Diep like sunlight, warm, gentle, impossible to resist. She looks back down at her notebook, eyes misty. "You always know what to say," she murmurs. "That's because I've lived long enough to make every mistake there is." Huyen replies with a chuckle. "But you remind me of myself at your age, so afraid of not being enough for the person I loved." Diep glances at her. "Did you ever feel afraid that love wouldn't last?" Huyen smiles wistfully. "Every woman does. When I married James's father, we had nothing but a small patch of land and a roof that leaked whenever it rained. People told him he could have done better. But he used to say, 'Better than love? I haven't found that yet.'" Diep's lips tremble, and she quickly wipes her eyes. "That's beautiful." "He was," Huyen says softly, her gaze distant for a moment. Then she looks back at Diep, eyes kind. "James has that same loyalty. That's why you shouldn't doubt him." Diep opens her mouth to reply, but just then, the front gate creaks. Heavy footsteps sound outside. She looks up, heart racing. James's voice calls out, "Mom! Diep! I'm back." Huyen rises immediately. "Perfect timing. I'll bring in the fruit he bought." When James enters, the late sunlight catches his profile, tired but smiling. He sets down a basket filled with guavas, oranges, and a few early grapefruits from the new trees. "Hey," he says gently, walking over to Diep. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she answers, her voice soft but steady. Your mom's been spoiling me. Huiyan chuckles from the corner, as if she'd let me do otherwise. You two talk. I'll check the soup. She slips out, leaving them in the quiet glow of the afternoon. James sits beside Diep, resting his elbows on his knees. You look stronger today. I'm trying, she says, fingers nervously fidgeting with the corner of her notebook. I was writing plans for the farm. The irrigation system still needs work, and the kitchen? He interrupts with a small laugh. You're supposed to rest, not draft a business proposal. I can't help it, Diep admits, smiling shyly. Thinking about the farm makes me feel like I'm still part of it. He looks at her, the laughter fading into tenderness. You are. Always will be. Her eyes glisten. Sometimes I worry you'll see how different our lives are and realize this doesn't make sense. He frowns. Who told you that? She shakes her head. No one. It's just your world feels so much bigger than mine. You've built things, managed people. I'm just a girl from a small town who got lucky you noticed her. James leans forward, his voice low. You think what we have is luck? Diep hesitates. Isn't it? No, he says, his tone firm but gentle. It's choice. Every day, I choose you. When you were sick, when the storms hit, when the workers doubted, still you. Because you make everything make sense. The words hit her like a wave, steady, undeniable, full of truth. She can barely find her voice. James. He reaches out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. I don't care about differences, Diep. I care about us. The world can say what it wants. I'm not letting anyone or anything change how I feel. Her heart swells, tears threatening to spill. Even your family? He smiles softly. You've already won them over. My mom talks about you more than me these days. From the kitchen, Huiyan's voice calls out teasingly, and I can still hear you two, you know. They both burst into laughter, the tension dissolving instantly. When the laughter fades, Diep looks at him, eyes glowing. I want to build that kitchen you talked about, the one by the orchard, not too high, just open enough for sunlight. James grins. Then we'll do it together. Once you're strong enough, we'll start. Outside, a light breeze passes through the bamboo fence, carrying the scent of ripening rice. It feels like the whole world is quietly listening to their conversation. Later that evening, the family gathers around the wooden table. Ni's laughter fills the air as she plays with slices of fruit, and Huiyan serves soup with a proud smile. James sits close to Diep, occasionally checking if she's eaten enough. The meal is simple: rice, soup, and laughter. But for Diep, it feels like a feast of belonging. After dinner, as dusk deepens into a velvety blue, she steps outside onto the porch. The stars shimmer faintly above the fields, and the croak of frogs fills the night air. James joins her, slipping his hand into hers. You cold? He asks quietly. She shakes her head. No, just thinking. About what? About us, she says honestly. About how lucky I am to have found this kind of love. He squeezes her hand. You're not lucky. We both worked for this. They fall into comfortable silence, watching the fireflies blink over the fields. Diep leans her head on his shoulder, her heart finally light. I talked to your mom today, she murmurs. I told her I love you And I told her, I want to marry you someday. James goes still, eyes wide. You did? Diep nods, smiling nervously. I was scared you'd think it's too soon, or that I'm asking for too much. He doesn't let her finish. Turning toward her, he cups her face in his hands. Too much? Diep. I've been wanting to ask you that same thing for months. She gasps softly. You mean? He grins. Not yet. I don't have the ring ready, and you still need to rest. But soon. His thumb brushes her cheek tenderly. When you're ready, and when we both stand on that farm we built together, that's when I'll ask. Her eyes shine in the moonlight. I'll be ready, she whispers. He smiles, leaning in until their foreheads touch. Then it's a promise. In the distance, the crickets hum, and the rice fields sway like a living ocean beneath the stars. Diep closes her eyes, letting the warmth of his hands and the peace of the night sink deep into her soul.